Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 128th deck and it's titled Exalted Deeds. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So jumping right into it this week, we have a fully random card, not one of the ones suggested by any viewers or patrons, which, by the way, if you're interested in suggesting cards for this channel, please put them in the comments. I will do my best to get to as many of them as possible. And while you're at it, you might as well like the video and subscribe to the channel. But otherwise, our random card of the week is going to be Akrasan Squire. I'm not 100% sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I wasn't playing back during Alara, so if I'm pronouncing it wrong, please let me know. But Akrasan Squire is 1 white for a 1/1 human soldier, and it has Exalted. So not too much to build off of for this deck. However, there is a commander in mono white that as soon as I saw this card, I knew I probably had to build it because I am very interested in how it works out. So we are playing mono white this week, and our commander is actually going to be Xenk, Paladin Unbroken. So Xenk is 2 white for a 2/4 human knight. He has double strike, and auras you control have Exalted. So we might as well build completely around Exalted if that's something that our random card can do. And yes, I know Xenk is a very expensive commander at a massive $19.78. That is a fifth of our budget right there in our commander. But luckily, a lot of the cards that work well with him and with Akrasan Squire aren't super expensive, so it does work out in the end. However, with all of that being said, let's take a quick look at some of the themes in our deck and kind of pick apart why this deck works the way that it does. So as you may already be able to guess, our first theme is Exalted, and more specifically Exalted, but wanting our creatures to attack alone so that way we can actually trigger Exalted. So for example, we have Angelic Benediction, which is 3 and a white for an enchantment. It has Exalted, and whenever a creature you control attacks alone, you may tap target creature. Now, it is worth pointing out that Exalted only triggers when we attack alone. So if we have multiple creatures and they all attack, Exalted does nothing. But if we have Xenk on board and we just attack with Xenk, he gets +1/+1 for every permanent on the board that has Exalted. So by giving all of our auras Exalted, if we have 5 auras on Xenk, he's getting +5/+5 when he attacks alone, which, considering he has double strike naturally, is going to be very, very strong. Now, with that being said, you could probably guess what our second theme is going to be, because that is going to be auras. And specifically, we're focusing on very cheap auras. Sometimes they may not even really do what we want them to do, but in effect, any 1 mana aura is basically a +1/+1 buff to our commander or to whatever other creature we're attacking with. So we can run cards like Genju of the Fields, which is 1 mana for, it says Enchant Plains, but it's an aura. And you can pay 2 until the end of turn. Enchanted Plains becomes a 2/5 white spirit creature with, whenever this creature deals damage, you gain that much life. It's still a land. And when Enchanted Plains is put into a graveyard, you may return Genju of the Fields from your graveyard to your hand. So one of the unique things about Genju of the Fields is that even though it goes on a land, it's still an aura we control on the battlefield, and that's actually going to make it a lot harder to get rid of, because our opponents really aren't going to be destroying our basic planes in the same way that they might be wanting to destroy our creatures. So we could actually turn Genju of the Fields into a 2/5, and if we have Xenk on board and only Genju of the Fields as our enchantment, then it actually becomes a 3/6 when it attacks. That doesn't technically have lifelink, but it still gains us that much life. And maybe we have something like Angelic Benediction to tap something down and give it another Exalted trigger. So you can kind of see what's going on here. We really want to stack up as many auras as possible and swing in with one massive creature. So then the question becomes, how do we get the cards in our hand to do this, and what creatures do we put them on if Xenk isn't an option? And that is where theme number 3 comes in, because we have creatures that specifically want us to either cast auras or cast enchantments. So Core Spirit Dancer is the perfect card to showcase this theme, because it is 1 and a white for a 0/2 core wizard. It gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it, and whenever we cast an aura spell, we may draw a card. So now, whether we're enchanting Core Spirit Dancer or not, we still get to draw cards off of our auras, and if we are enchanting Core Spirit Dancer, she's getting +2/+2, and also getting the Exalted triggers from all of our stuff from Xenk, making her a massive threat very, very quickly. And yes, she's still not going to be quite as threatening as Xenk because with Double Strike and Commander damage, he can knock people out very, very quickly. But we do need to make sure we have some backup creatures in the deck just in case we can't quite get there with Xenk. So Core Spirit Dancer is perfect because she's card draw, she's aggro, and she really showcases what we're trying to do with the deck. So with all of that being said, let's move on from our themes and get into some of our key cards. And these are the cards that either synergize really well with what we're trying to do, or they might be ways that push us toward a victory. So the first card that I really want to talk about is going to be Lightpaw's Emperor's Voice. It is 1 and a white for a 2/2 Fox Advisor. Whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, if you cast it, you may search your library for an aura card with mana value less than or equal to that aura and with a different name than each aura you control. Put that card onto the battlefield attached to Lightpaw's Emperor's Voice, then shuffle. So that is a lot of words, but essentially what it means is every time we cast an aura, we get a second aura tutored right out of our deck into play attached to Lightpaw's. So this can do one of two things depending on how we want to run our game plan. We can be attaching the original aura to a different creature, like Xenk for example, and then when we get the second aura put on Lightpaw's, we're getting 2 auras that have Exalted because of Xenk, but we're also building up 2 massive threats, so we can really just attack with one of them. Maybe someone kills it, we still have a second threat laying around just in case. However, we could also just go all in on Lightpaw's, attach an aura to it, search our deck for another one, put that aura on Lightpaw's as well, and then make Lightpaw's a massive threat that our opponents can't deal with, in the hopes that we'll be able to get through some sort of damage. Now, Lightpaw's, unlike Xenk, doesn't have Double Strike innately, so we do have to do a little bit more work to make it a lethal threat, especially because it's not our commander, so we do need to do a full 40 damage rather than 21, but that's still something that's incredibly powerful, and being able to just get 2 auras every time we cast one is very impressive, especially since they're all going to have Exalted. Now, moving into our next key card, it's going to be a little bit disappointing because I know we're an aura deck, but we're only really talking about creatures for some reason. Our next card is Sublime Archangel. And Sublime Archangel is 2 white for a 4/3 angel. She has flying, Exalted, and other creatures you control have Exalted. And the reminder text on Sublime Archangel is very important here because it says, if a creature has multiple instances of Exalted, each triggers separately. So if we have Sublime Archangel and Akrasan Squire in play, we get to give Akrasan Squire 2 different cases of Exalted, and both of them trigger when we attack. So we don't really want to have a huge board of creatures, but if for some reason we're in the position where we're drawing all of our creatures and none of our auras, Sublime Archangel still gives us the ability to give our entire team Exalted, so that way when we attack with a creature, even though we may not have a ton of auras on it, it's still going to get the really big buff from all of our creatures being in play. So I think that alone earns it a spot in our key cards, but it can also kind of be used as a finisher, because if nobody's expecting this to hit the battlefield, nobody's thinking, oh, I don't have to worry about, the 5 extra damage or whatever, all of a sudden Sublime Archangel comes down and changes the math a lot, especially when we're looking at Xenk with Double Strike. Maybe we have something like flying, maybe we have protection from other creatures, anything that can kind of help get our board through. So Sublime Archangel is very, very powerful and can kind of steal games out of nowhere. And moving into our last card, once again continuing the tradition of talking about non-auras in our aura deck, we have Umbra Mystic. So while she may not be an aura herself, she really cares about us casting auras. So Umbra Mystic is 2 and a white for a 2/2 human wizard, and it simply says auras attached to permanents you control have totem armor. This is extremely powerful in our deck because we are always going to be going all in on one, maybe two creatures. So to have them be under constant threat of being destroyed is a big problem. If someone destroys one of our creatures that has 5 auras on it, we just lose all those auras and we lose all the work that we've put in. So Umbra Mystic being able to give all of our auras totem armor means that if our souped up creature dies, we instead just remove one of the auras from it and it sticks around. So now instead of losing our commander and 5 auras, we just lose one of the auras on it. We can try to pick the least impactful one if we need to. And that way, we're able to really keep pushing through damage. We're able to keep being a threat even when our opponents have removal, because worst case scenario, they destroy Umbra Mystic and then try to destroy our commander. But if they're throwing a removal spell at something that's not our big Voltron threat, we're probably pretty okay with that. And that doesn't stop us from putting at least one aura on Umbra Mystic to protect her as well. So a lot of different usage we can get out of this one card. But those are all of our key cards for this week, and I think the next thing we're going to have to do is talk a little bit about some cool interactions. These are cards in the deck that really synergize well with each other and work to either give us a lot of value or sometimes are just unique in a way that I want to highlight, because I think they might not always be super common but are still pretty powerful when working together. So our first cool interaction that I want to highlight is between Conviction and Sram Senior Edificer. So we'll start off with Sram. So Sram is 1 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature, Dwarf Advisor. Whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. Most of that is not going to be relevant. Obviously, drawing a card for an aura is extremely relevant and honestly makes Sram one of the best creatures in our entire deck. But what's going to make him even better is if we pair him up with Conviction, because Conviction is 1 and a white for an enchantment, aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+3, and while that's not super impressive, the really good part about Conviction is that you can also pay a white mana and return it to its owner's hand. So we have a lot of ways to make our enchantments cost less in this deck, and if that's the case, we could cast this for 1 mana, draw a card, return it back to our hand for 1 mana, and then cast it again to draw another mana. And even if we don't have any cost reduction, this is 3 mana to draw a card in mono white, which is not the best rate, but it's certainly not the worst. So Conviction is going to play into a lot of our synergies, drawing us cards, whether it's with Sram or with the Core Spirit Dancer or some of our other effects that we have. So really, more so than it being an aura and more so than it being an enchantment, is the fact that it triggers much of our card draw. And yeah, it could be used to give Exalted, and yeah, it could give +1/+3, but if we're being perfectly honest, the buff is kind of negligible, so it's really just in here for the ability to bounce itself back, and that could be a massive engine if we get it going. So that is cool interaction number 1, and number 2 is going to be a little bit different. This one is going to be Holy Avenger and Celestial Mantle. So Holy Avenger is the only equipment in the entire deck. It is 2 and a white for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature has double strike. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage, you may put an aura card from your hand onto the battlefield attached to it, and then it equips for 2 and a white. So if we have, well, I was going to say Xenk, but maybe something that doesn't naturally have double strike, so that way we can hit twice, we will attack, say, Akrasan Squire. We hit the first time because of double strike, and as soon as we hit the first time, we put an aura from our hand onto the battlefield attached to the creature. Then we hit a second time because of double strike, and we get to do it again. So obviously we want some of the biggest and splashiest auras to be able to use with Holy Avenger, and one of the biggest and splashiest is Celestial Mantle, because Celestial Mantle is 3 white, white, white for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +3/+3. That's not super big, but whenever enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, double its controller's life total. So if we have 10 life and no other enchantments on our creature, we attack with Holy Avenger, we put Celestial Mantle in on the first hit, meaning on the second hit we can double our life total to 20. Then next turn, we hit twice with Celestial Mantle, we go from 20 to 40, 40 to 80. We can get really out of hand very, very quickly, especially because Double Strike is going to be triggering Celestial Mantle twice each combat. So obviously, there are a ton of great auras that work well with Holy Avenger, especially because we get to just put them in for free. But I think Celestial Mantle is kind of the timmiest version of it. It's just doing big life gain stuff and kind of just being a nuisance to the rest of the table, because at that point, there's not too much that the rest of the table can do to take you out, other than, of course, maybe getting rid of the creature. But I think that this is at least a very fun combo. Even if it doesn't win the game on its own, it does enough to stop you from losing. And with the way that the deck functions, even just gaining a little bit of life can really be enough to put you over the edge and slowly close out the game with little attacks from Xenk here and there. And of course, other creatures as well. I keep saying Xenk because, again, 21 commander damage is just easier to get to in this deck than any other amount of damage. So those are all of our cool interactions, and of course, the last thing we got to do with our deck tech is talk about the price. So this week, the deck's price came out to $98.67, which is a pretty expensive deck. We were very, very close to our budget limit, and as we've already talked about, Xenk is our most expensive card. If you wanted to change the way that the deck works, you could actually take Xenk out and probably put Light Paws in his place. I don't think the deck would be quite as good, and there would definitely need to be some changes that were made. But if you're looking to run mostly this deck for a much cheaper cost, you could swap Xenk out, and that pretty much puts the deck down to about $80, give or take a couple. So definitely something you can think about. However, since it was built around Xenk and giving auras Exalted, there, like I said, would have to be a couple of changes made, and I'm not going to go into all of that. So rather than discussing taking out the commander, let's take a look at our second most expensive card in the deck and talk about whether or not that is worth cutting. So the second most expensive card in the deck is Hallowed Haunting at $6.81. So again, if you're talking about cutting a card out of the deck, this would trim you down to about $91. And Hallowed Haunting is a very good card and definitely very worth it in the deck, because it is 2 white for an enchantment. As long as you control 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance, which is very good when we're trying to attack and block. And whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a white spirit cleric creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of spirits you control. So the more enchantments we cast, the more spirits we get, and the bigger the spirits get. This is a great way to prevent us from dying from going too tall, just having one big creature. We attack and then we can't block, and all of a sudden our opponents can just kill us on the backswing. If we are making spirits, we still have blockers, plus we could get flying, we could get vigilance, and most importantly, if we have something like Exalted Angel and we can get a bunch of different spirits and then give them all Exalted, we can really go very, very quick with this deck. We can do a ton of damage very, very quickly. So Hallowed Haunting is a great card all around. It's great for offense, it's great for defense, it's great for just getting a little bit of evasion. Flying is a little bit harder to come by than you might expect, at least at a relatively decent rate. So Hallowed Haunting is very good, but like I said earlier, if you do need to cut it for budget purposes, you can, of course, trim it down. The deck wouldn't be that much worse without it. However, I do think it is better for the inclusion. Now, talking about cards you can take out of the deck to decrease the budget, of course, means that we also have to talk about a card that you could put into the deck to increase the budget. And since we're talking about putting a card in, it's worth talking about a card to take out. So this week, the card I would recommend putting into this deck to make it just a little bit better would be Flickering Ward. So earlier we talked a little bit about Conviction being able to bounce itself back to your hand. Flickering Ward does the exact same thing, but it also does a little bit more. It's not just giving you +1/+3, it's 1 white for an enchantment aura. When you play Flickering Ward, choose a color. Enchanted creature gains protection from the chosen color, and pay a white, return Flickering Ward to its owner's hand. So this is not just a 1-mana enchantment that can bounce itself back to your hand, but it's a 1-mana enchantment that can bounce itself back to your hand and protect whatever creature you need it to be protecting. Now, I do want to give a little word of warning to this, because I've seen plenty of people make this mistake in the past. if you have a creature that has a ton of auras on it, in our case, they're going to be white auras because we are a mono white deck. And if you choose to give that creature protection from white, it will gain protection from all of the auras that are equipped to it, and they will all fall off and go to the graveyard. So make sure you're not making that mistake because, like I said, I have seen that mistake made many times. I'm sure I've made it myself. I don't remember a specific time, but that's probably happened to me before. And so if you are looking to put in Flickering Ward, the card I would recommend taking out is Equinox. So Equinox is 1 white for an enchant land aura. Tap land enchanted with Equinox to counter a spell that destroys 1 or more of your lands. This ability is played as an interrupt. So a little bit of old speech on there, I suppose, but in this case, it just counters a spell that destroys 1 of our lands. It's probably not going to be super relevant because it doesn't tap to stop abilities, it only taps to stop spells. So if someone uses like a Field of Ruin to blow up 1 of our lands, we can't stop it, unfortunately. And if I'm being perfectly honest, this is really only in here because it's an enchant land, so it's hard to get rid of, and it's 1 mana, and it's an aura, so it triggers Xenk. But Flickering Ward kind of hits all of those as well, except for the enchant land part. But I think it's a lot better in this case. So if you can put that in instead of kind of a do-nothing enchantment, that would obviously improve the power level of the deck pretty significantly. So that brings us to the end of our actual deck tech, but we do have to make sure that we test this deck out. We got to see how it performs in a game. And of course, before we get to that, we got to talk about some ways that you can support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That helps out so much, and I thank you all so much for all of the support. But if you're looking to reach out on other platforms as well, you can find me over on Twitter at 13POYNZ. You can find me on Reddit, u/POYNZ13. I make sure to post the videos on both of those places every single week, so if you happen to miss it somehow, it will be there. I also do another short little write-up as a deck tech over on Reddit, so if you're interested in reading a little bit more about it, you can check it out over there. You can also send me an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com, and if you're looking to actually support the channel a little bit more directly, you can find us over on Patreon, or you can become a channel member right here on YouTube, and you can join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Devin Purser, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, and Paddywhack. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And if you're wondering what you get from being a channel member or a patron, you actually get access to things like a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks. And also, that's the first place I look for players when I'm recording the games for this channel. You get the guarantee from me that any card you suggest will be turned into a video for this channel eventually. I will do my best to get to everyone who suggests them that are not patrons or channel members, but I do run out of time sometimes, so I can't promise that to anyone but our patrons and channel members. You'll also get a random card shipped to you every single month. It will be one of the cards we built around that month as a thank you from me, as well as a beautiful little hand-drawn token to go with it. Maybe it fits in the deck, maybe not, who's to say. You could also get the unedited gameplay videos so you can hear the players talking and having a good time, sometimes maybe making fun of each other a little bit, instead of my own narration over a shortened version of it. So if you are interested in any of that, please do check it out. Oh, and of course, I gotta mention, I almost completely forgot, that you also get the deck lists an entire week early. So there are times when I post the deck lists and the patrons or channel members catch some mistakes that I've made, such as putting a card in that may or may not fit with a certain companion, so I'm able to change it in time for the video. So I appreciate all of the help that my channel members and patrons give in that regard, and if you would also like to see the deck lists a week early so I can get some feedback, that is a great way to do it. Now, I think that I've done enough talking about some ways to support the channel, so let's check out this game and see who we're going to be playing against this week. So, as always, we are going to have 3 opponents, and this week we are going to be joined by Bilal playing Crick, Son of Yawgmoth, Shawn playing Go-Shintai of Life's Origin, and Jason playing Daxos the Returned. So, starting off with Bilal and his Crick, Son of Yawgmoth deck. This is, in his own words, a black good stuff deck. He just kind of filled it with as many good black cards as possible. There's not too much of a theme or synergy to it other than just a little bit of black devotion, being able to play very powerful black spells, a lot of doubling his mana and gaining life and making his opponents lose life. So I am definitely very worried about this deck. I know Crick is a very powerful commander, and I know Bilal has a bit of a penchant, I think is how you would say it, for combos, and I know Crick can definitely fuel some combos. So very interested to see how this deck turns out. And I know that there's a lot of cool cards in here that we're going to see because Mono Black Good Stuff is a very powerful archetype that just has a ton of good cards. I mean, obviously, it's called Good Stuff for a reason. So I am pretty worried about that one. Next up, we have Shawn and his Go-Shintai of Life's Origin deck. This is, as you may be able to guess, a Shrine deck, and it is 5 colors. I know Go-Shintai doesn't look like it, but because of the ability, it is 5 colors. And Shawn has played this deck a couple of times on the channel. He hasn't quite been able to get it to go off. He kind of keeps running into some issues with people running enchantment removal. And obviously, while you should always run enchantment removal, it hurts when a lot of your creatures are also enchantments. So that could be a bit of a drawback, but I am very interested to see how it goes. Every time this deck comes up, it's a ton of fun to play against. And then finally, we have Jason and his Daxos the Returned deck. And yes, this is also an enchantment deck. So not only are we playing an enchantment deck, and Shawn is playing an enchantment deck, but Jason is also playing an enchantment deck. So there are 3 total Enchantress decks at the table, and Daxos this time is going to be focused on Orzhov enchantments. And Orzhov is definitely Jason's bread and butter. It is his go-to color combination, so if anyone can pull it off, it is definitely him. And I know he's very good with aristocrats. I'm not quite sure how Daxos is going to play into that, but I would not be surprised if there are some aristocrat shenanigans inside of an enchantment shell. So I'm very interested to see how it goes. I haven't played against Daxos too many times, so I don't really know what to expect. I don't know what black enchantments are going to be in here because, again, I'm not super familiar with that one. So overall, very interested to see how it turns out. I think if I had to pick one of these opponents that I would say I'm the most concerned about, it's probably Crick. Let me know down in the comments if you agree with that assessment or maybe someone else looks a little bit more scary up front. But I think that is probably all we need to talk about before we get into the game itself. So, like I said earlier, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and then myself. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a Swamp. Shawn plays an Arcane Sanctum. Jason plays a Plains. I play a Plains. Bilal plays a Swamp and then casts Treasure Map. Shawn plays a Forest and casts Sithis Harvest's Hand, letting him gain a life and draw a card whenever he casts an enchantment spell. Jason plays a Swamp and casts Felwar Stone. I play a Plains. In Bilal's upkeep, he activates the Treasure Map to scry 1 and put a landmark counter on it. Then he plays a Thespian Stage and passes. Shawn plays a Ketria Triome and casts Jukai Naturalist, making all his enchantments cost 1 less to cast. This also triggers Sithis, gaining him a life and letting him draw a card. He then moves to combat and attacks Jason for 1 with Sithis. Jason plays a Swamp and casts his commander, Daxos the Returned, getting an experience counter whenever he casts an enchantment and letting him pay 3 mana to make a spirit token with power and toughness equal to the experience counters he has. I play a Plains and cast Mesa Enchantress, letting me draw a card whenever I cast an enchantment. In Bilal's upkeep, he activates Treasure Map to scry 1 and put a landmark counter on it. He then plays a Swamp and casts Burnished Heart. Shawn plays an island and casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand. Jason casts a Starfield Mystic, making his enchantments cost 1 less to cast and getting a +1/+1 counter whenever an enchantment goes to his graveyard from the battlefield. This lets him cast Grim Guardian, getting an experience counter and making each of his opponents lose a life when it or another enchantment enters under his control. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 2 with Daxos. I play a Rogue's Passage and cast Transcendent Envoy, drawing a card and making my aura spells cost 1 less to cast. In Bilal's upkeep, he activates the treasure map, scrying 1 and transforming it since it now has 3 counters. This turns into Treasure Cove, makes him 3 treasure tokens, and lets him tap it to sacrifice a treasure to draw a card. He then plays a swamp and passes. Shawn plays a forest and casts his commander, Go-Shintai of Life's Origin, letting him make a 1/1 shrine token whenever it or another non-token shrine enters under his control. This also triggers Sithis, drawing him a card and gaining him a life. He then casts Honden of Cleansing Fire, drawing a card, gaining a life, making a shrine token, and letting him gain 2 life in his upkeep for each shrine he controls. Jason plays an Esper Panorama, then casts Sphere of Safety, getting an experience counter, making each opponent lose a life, and also making each opponent pay mana equal to the number of enchantments he controls to attack him. Afterwards, he casts Nyxborn Eidolon, getting another experience counter and making each opponent lose another life. I play a Plains, then cast Tenuous Truce, drawing a card and enchanting Bilal, so at the end of his turn, he and I both draw a card. Since the truce is sacrificed if Bilal or I attack each other, Bilal knows I'm not attacking him, so he sacrifices his Burnished Heart to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Then I cast my commander Xenk, Paladin Unbroken, giving all my auras Exalted. Bilal casts Gauntlet of Power, naming black, so all black creatures get +1/+1, and all basic lands that produce black mana produce an additional black mana. Then he casts Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life to give each creature -4/-4, only leaving behind the Grim Guardian thanks to the buff it received from the Gauntlet of Power. Once that's resolved, he casts Braids Arisen Nightmare and moves to his end step, triggering Braids and sacrificing a treasure, making each opponent either sacrifice an artifact or lose 2 life, letting Bilal draw a card. None of his opponents sacrifice an artifact, so we all lose 2 life and Bilal draws 3, then he and I both draw an additional card from the Tenuous Truce. In Shawn's upkeep, he gains 2 life thanks to the Honden of Cleansing Fire, plays a swamp, then casts Mirari's Wake, giving all his creatures +1/+1, and letting his lands tap for an additional mana. He then recasts his commander, Go-Shintai of Life's Origin, making a shrine token when it enters. On Jason's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking me for 2 with the Grim Guardian, then casts Nightmare Shepherd, letting him exile any non-token creature that dies under his control and create a 1/1 copy of it, making each opponent lose a life. He then casts Archaeomancer's Map, searching his library for 2 plains, putting them into his hand, and being able to put a land from his hand into play whenever an opponent plays a land, if that opponent controls more lands than he does. Then he plays a Plains and passes. On my turn, I play a Plains and cast my own Sphere of Safety. Bilal plays a Cabal Coffers, triggering Archaeomancer's Map, so Jason puts a Plains into play. Bilal then casts his commander, Crick, Son of Yawgmoth, letting him pay 2 life instead of a black mana for any black cost in his spells or abilities, and also putting a +1/+1 counter on him whenever Bilal casts a black spell. After that, he casts Shieldred Whispering One, putting a counter on Crick, making each opponent sacrifice a creature in their upkeep, and also returning a creature from his graveyard to play in his upkeep. Then in his end step, Bilal sacrifices a treasure for Braids, and since none of his opponents sacrifice an artifact, they all lose 2 life while Bilal draws 3, then he and I both draw an additional card. In Shawn's upkeep, he gains 6 life from his Honden, then sacrifices his shrine token to Shieldred. He plays a mountain, letting Jason play a swamp, and activates Go-Shintai, returning Sithis from his graveyard to play. After that, he casts Go-Shintai of Shared Purpose, drawing a card, gaining a life, creating a shrine token, and letting him pay a mana in his end step to make a number of 1/1 spirit tokens equal to the number of shrines he controls. After that, he casts Mirror Maid, entering as a copy of Go-Shintai of Shared Purpose, drawing a card, gaining a life, and making a shrine token. Notably, since Go-Shintai of Shared Purpose is legendary, he should have sacrificed one of the 2 versions of it, but we don't catch that at the time. After that, he casts Kenrith's Transformation, enchanting Shieldred to turn her into a 3/3 elk with no abilities, and this also draws Shawn 2 cards and gains him a life. In his end step, he pays for both of the Shared Purposes, creating a total of 10 1/1 spirit tokens. Jason plays a Plains and recasts his commander Daxos, then casts Cunning Rhetoric, making each opponent lose a life, getting an experience counter, and letting him exile the top card of an opponent's library whenever they attack him, being able to play the exiled card. He then moves to combat and attacks Shawn for 4 with the Nightmare Shepherd. I play a Plains and recast my commander Xenk, then at the end of turn, Bilal activates Thespian Stage, turning it into a copy of Cabal Coffers. On Bilal's turn, he casts Nirkana Revenant, letting his swamps tap for yet another additional black mana, and putting a counter on Crick. He then plays a swamp and casts Crushing Disappointment, making each player lose 2 life and drawing himself 2 cards, putting another counter on Crick. He also casts Phyrexian Reclamation, putting another counter on Crick. Then, in his end step, Bilal sacrifices Sheoldred to Braids, drawing 2 cards, while Jason and I lose 2 life and Shawn sacrifices a Spirit. Then Bilal and I both draw an additional card, and Jason activates Daxos, making a 4/4 Spirit token since he has 4 experience counters, making each opponent lose a life. In Shawn's upkeep, he gains 10 life from his Honden, then activates his commander to return Jukai Naturalist from his graveyard to the battlefield, making all his enchantments cost 1 less to cast. He also casts Whirlwind of Thought, letting him draw a card whenever he casts a non-creature spell, and this draws him a card when it's cast and gains him a life. After that, he casts Go-Shintai of Boundless Vigor, drawing a card, gaining a life, making a shrine token, and letting him pay 1 mana in his end step to put a number of +1/+1 counters on a creature equal to the number of shrines he controls. He also casts Helm of the Host, drawing another card. He then attacks Bilal for 18 total damage with his spirit tokens, but before blocks, Bilal casts Sudden Spoiling, putting a counter on Crick, making all of Shawn's creatures 0/2s with no abilities, however they do still get +1/+1 from Mirari's Wake. Bilal also activates Phyrexian Reclamation, paying 2 life to return Sheoldred from his graveyard to his hand, then he blocks 3 of the spirits, killing them, taking 6, but also gaining 7. On Jason's turn, he sacrifices his Esper Panorama to search his library for a basic land and put it into play tapped. He then plays a Fetid Heath, and at the end of turn, Bilal sacrifices a treasure. I play a Plains and cast Elend Umbra, enchanting Xenk, giving him +0/+4 and Totem Armor. Then I cast Daybreak Coronet, also enchanting Xenk, giving him +3/+3, Vigilance, First Strike, and Lifelink. I move to combat and attack Shawn with Xenk, triggering Exalted on my 3 auras, so it's a total of 8 power with double strike. He blocks with Jukai Naturalist, gaining 2 life, while I gain 8. Bilal casts Visara the Dreadful, which can tap to destroy a creature, putting a counter on Crick. He also activates Phyrexian Reclamation, paying 2 life to return Sazon, Perverter of Truth, from his graveyard to his hand, casting it to let each player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life in their upkeep, putting another counter on Crick. After that, he casts Animate Dead, putting yet another counter on Crick, returning Burnished Heart from his graveyard to the battlefield. After that, he casts Grey Merchant of Asphodel, putting a counter on Crick, but Shawn responds with a counter spell, preventing the zombie from resolving. Unfortunately, Bilal is able to cast Reanimate, returning Grey Merchant from the graveyard to the battlefield, losing 5 life since its mana value is 5, putting a counter on Crick, making each opponent lose life equal to his Devotion to Black, which is 16, then he gains life equal to life lost this way, gaining 48. After that, he casts Languish, putting another counter on Crick, giving all creatures -4/-4, clearing away most of Shawn and Jason's board. Finally, he plays Bojuka Bog, exiling Shawn's graveyard, and attacks Shawn for 19 damage with his 3 creatures that can attack, gaining 9 life. In his end step, he sacrifices Grey Merchant to Braids, but since no other player sacrifices a creature, he draws 3 cards while his opponents lose 2 life, then he and I draw an additional card. In Shawn's upkeep, he gains 4 life, draws 2 cards, loses 2 life, then plays a Plains and casts Archon of Sun's Grace, giving his Pegasus creatures lifelink and making a 2/2 Pegasus whenever an enchantment enters under his control. He then casts his own Sphere of Safety, making a Pegasus token and drawing a card, casts Honden of Life's Web, drawing a card, making a shrine, making 2 Pegasus, and letting him create a number of 1/1 spirit tokens equal to the shrines he controls in his upkeep. He also casts Sanctum of Tranquil Light, making a shrine token, 2 Pegasus tokens, and drawing a card. He casts Farseek, searching his library for a Temple Garden, putting it into play tapped, drawing another card, then equips Helm of the Host to Go-Shintai of Life's Origin, letting him make a non-legendary copy of it when he moves to combat, which he does, copying Life's Origin, making 2 more Shrine tokens and 3 more Pegasus tokens. In Jason's upkeep, he draws 2 cards and loses 2 life, then recasts his commander Daxos. In my upkeep, I draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, then play a Plains and activate Rogue's Passage, making Xenk unblockable this turn. I cast Knight of Glory, which has Exalted, and also cast Guard Duty, enchanting Nightmare Shepherd so that it has Defender. This lets me attack Bilal with Xenk, sacrificing the Tenuous Truce, but still getting the Exalted trigger from it and all my other auras. Then, before the damage, I cast Karametra's Blessing to give Xenk an additional +2/+2, hitting Bilal for a total of 24 damage, knocking him out of the game with commander damage. Unfortunately, at this point, Jason and I have no way to combat Shawn's mana production, so he's able to easily pay for our Spears of Safety, running us over with Shrines on his turn, and winning Shawn the game. Alright, so that was a super sweet game. Now, I will say, definitely a very weird game. I don't think I've ever seen a game where 3 different players all played Sphere of Safety before, and definitely wound up hurting Jason and I at the end because we couldn't push through Shawn's board, and Shawn had way too much mana, so he was easily able to pay for our spheres, but we couldn't pay for his, really letting him easily wrap up the game. But overall, I do think that it was very impressive showing by the Shrines. I think that even though we had the mistake with having 2 of the same Shrine in play, even though they were both legendary, I don't think that really affected the game in any meaningful way, so I don't think it was something that's going to change the outcome. But it was super cool to see him start going off at the end and just playing Shrine after Shrine after Shrine and making a bunch of tokens. And being able to put Helm of the Host onto Go-Shintai was absolutely devastating for the rest of us, because then it meant that the number of shrines he was making for each other shrine he played was increasing just by a tremendous amount, going from 2 to 3 to 4, and eventually he was going to get to the point where every shrine coming in just kind of cleared out the board with the amount of shrines he was going to be making. So definitely a very impressive showing, and I'm glad that we finally got to see Go-Shintai go off, because I know he's really been trying to make it work in the past. Moving around the table, talk a little bit about Daxos. I don't think Jason really got much of the setup that he wanted because the Toxic Deluge set him back quite a bit. But I do think that the Grim Guardian put in a lot of work for him, even more than I might have expected. I do think that that's probably one of the MVPs of any Enchantress deck that has black in it, just because of how powerful that card can be. And I kind of underestimated it every other time I've seen it in the past, but in this case, I think it really outshone some of the cards in his deck and definitely deserved a spot as probably his MVP. And I also think Nightmare Shepherd, had it come down just a turn earlier before the Toxic Deluge, could have put in a lot of work as well. So definitely very cool. I would love to see this deck again in the future. I think it did quite well throughout the game, and honestly, it was kind of unique seeing an Orzhov Enchantress deck. I guess our deck would be up next. I was very impressed with how Xenk performed. We struggled a little bit in the early game, especially losing some of our ramp and card draw, but I think by the end of it, being able to just kind of suit Xenk up almost out of nowhere and just come in and knock Bilal out of the game. Yeah, we had to spend pretty much every single card in our hand to do it, but it was at that point when he was about to win the game on his turn, so I knew that he had to be dealt with. I was hoping Shawn wouldn't be able to win the game on his turn, and I was unfortunately wrong. So definitely a good showing by Xenk, and I think if we had been able to keep our card draw and keep our ramp, I think that would have been a very different game, because we probably could have just started taking people out a lot earlier. So very good showing. Let me know what you think of the deck in the comments below. If there's any improvements you think we could add, if there's any cards that should go in or cards that should come out, I would love to hear it. But of course, we still got one more deck to talk about. We got to talk about Bilal's deck. When I said earlier that that was the one I was the most afraid of, I think I had every right to be, because that was an incredibly powerful showing from Bilal's deck. He was able to get a ton of permanents into play. He was able to get a ton of creatures into play. And for a while there, when he had Shieldred in play, I was worried we really weren't going to do anything for the rest of the game, considering how much of a Voltron strategy we are. So the fact that it got taken care of very quickly was very appreciated. I know Shawn could have hit anything else, so I do appreciate that he hit Shieldred with his Kenrith's transformation. But overall, very impressive, and there was definitely that point at the end when if Bilal had had a sacrifice outlet, he could have looped his Grey Merchant and definitely done enough damage to kill the table. And since it was in his graveyard going into his last turn, he was preparing to take us out on his turn. So very impressive showing. Definitely a scary deck. He didn't quite get there, but he was very, very close. So overall, I had a ton of fun with the game. I hope you all enjoyed watching it. I hope you all enjoyed the deck tech as well. And please let me know in the comments if there's any cards that you would like to see me turn into a deck in the future. But otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will talk to you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.